Every evening an old German shepherd waited outside a retired Navy SEAL's workshop in the snow. Then one day she refused the food he had left for her and quietly asked him to follow. She led Ethan to a forgotten mountain station, a grieving photographer, and photographs that had been made to tell a lie. The lie could force more than 100 workers from the homes they had built their lives around. But Fable's greatest lesson was not about exposing evidence or winning an argument. It was about slowing down, staying beside the last person, and keeping the door open until everyone was safe. Tell us where you are watching from, and please like and subscribe to help Seal K 9 Tails reach 5,000 subscribers and keep these stories coming. Winter sunlight reached Alder Basin late and left early. For a few bright hours each day, it poured over the San Juan Mountains and turned the snowfields into sheets of white fire. Lift cables stitched dark lines between the ridges. Maintenance roads curved through the valley like silver thread, disappearing beneath pines, worker housing, fuel sheds, and the broad roofs of buildings built to endure weather longer than memory. By 4:30, the light had already begun withdrawing from the valley. Ethan Duvall stood beneath a raised snowcat inside the San Juan Utility Cooperative Workshop, listening to an engine complain. The sound was faint, a dry metallic flutter beneath the louder churn of the idle, but Ethan heard it immediately. At 53, he trusted noises more than faces. A worn bearing did not pretend it was merely tired. A failing belt did not smile while calculating what silence might cost. He reached into the cramped space with a wrench and turned his head slightly so the loose front of his ash-brown hair would stop falling into his eyes. Silver had begun spreading through it at the temples, though the workshop lights made the color look almost bronze. His olive-drab combat shirt fit close across his chest, its faded camouflage sleeves marked by dark bands around the upper arms. Grease had found the fabric near one elbow despite his best efforts, as grease usually did. "Tell me you found it," Saul Hester called from behind the parts counter. "I found 3 things." "Are any of them cheap?" "No." Saul sighed with theatrical grief. At 58, Saul had the broad, comfortable build of a man who believed chairs should apologize when they were too narrow. A silver mustache occupied most of his upper lip, and a red bandana was tied around his left wrist, beneath the cuff of his flannel shirt. He had been Ethan's business partner for 11 years, and his friend long enough to recognize when silence meant concentration, irritation, or hunger. This silence meant all 3. Saul glanced toward the rear bay door. "Your appointment's here." Ethan slid out from beneath the snowcat and sat up. "I don't have an appointment." "You have the same appointment every afternoon." Beyond the open service bay, beneath the narrow metal awning where wind-blown snow rarely reached, a German shepherd sat watching them. She had appeared for the first time 22 days earlier. Ethan knew because the date was written on a piece of masking tape stuck beside the workshop sink, though he would have denied keeping count if Saul ever asked. On that first evening, the dog had stood near the edge of the parking lot, thin enough that the slope of her ribs showed beneath the dull gold and black of her coat. She wore an old red rescue harness, faded nearly brown, with the rectangular name patch cut away. The handle along her back was frayed. One metal buckle had been replaced with a strip of leather tied in a practical knot. She had accepted food only after Ethan placed it down and retreated behind the bay door. Since then, she had returned after closing time with the reliability of a clock that refused ownership. Her muzzle had gone silver unevenly, more heavily along the right side. Her left ear carried a small triangular notch and tipped forward when she was uncertain. She never barked, never begged, never approached while another person stood nearby. Ethan opened a cabinet and removed a small tin of liver pâté. Saul leaned against the counter. "You know, for a man who claims not to like emotional obligations, you buy remarkably expensive dog food." "It was on sale." "It has a French label." "Dogs can't read French." "That is not the defense you think it is." Ethan ignored him and stepped outside. The cold settled over him quickly, reaching through the combat shirt before he pulled on his rust-brown canvas jacket. Snow lay clean across the yard except for the dog's tracks and the tire marks leading to the service road. The mountains beyond the cooperative buildings had turned pale blue beneath the lowering sky. He crouched several yards from her and peeled back the tin lid. The shepherd watched his hands. "You missed yesterday," Ethan said. Her expression did not change. "I'm not criticizing. I'm documenting poor attendance." One ear shifted. He placed the tin on the packed snow and moved away. Usually she waited until he had retreated at least 10 paces. That afternoon she did not move toward the food at all. She lowered her head, sniffed once, then turned toward the northern maintenance road. Ethan frowned. The dog took 6 steps, stopped, and looked back. "The food is here." She returned to him. Not to the tin, to him. For the first time in 22 days, she crossed the distance she had guarded so carefully. Ethan remained still as her dark nose touched the back of his gloved hand. The contact lasted less than a second. Then she withdrew and walked toward the road again. Something inside Ethan shifted, not tenderness exactly, and not alarm. It was the sensation of hearing a machine change pitch before a warning light appeared. Saul had come to the bay entrance. The humor had left his face. "That's new," he said. Ethan rose. 3 days earlier, he had left a humane trap under the awning, covered with a blanket and baited with warm meat. The dog had circled it once, studied the latch, and slept 10 feet away as if refusing an insulting contract. Deputy Rena Cobb had checked every missing animal notice in the county and 2 neighboring jurisdictions. No match, no active working dog registration, no report of an elderly shepherd in a damaged rescue harness. Now the dog had touched him and was walking away without eating. Ethan entered the workshop and took a first aid kit from the wall. Saul watched him add a flashlight, spare batteries, a radio, and 2 chemical heat packs to an old canvas bag. "You're following her?" "I'm checking the north road." "With pâté?" Ethan placed the unopened second tin in the bag. "Emergency ration." "For which one of you?" Ethan zipped the bag. Saul lifted both hands. "I withdraw the question on medical grounds." The dog waited at the edge of the yard until Ethan joined her. Then she turned into the trees. The northern road had not been plowed in several days. At first, the route was easy to follow, a shallow white channel between stands of spruce and fir. The shepherd kept a steady pace but never moved so far ahead that Ethan lost sight of her. When he slowed, she slowed. When the trail forked near an old avalanche marker, she chose the lower path through denser timber instead of the exposed ridge road. That choice interested him. The lower route was longer but protected from wind. It also climbed toward Bellwatch Hut, an old ski patrol station that had been removed from regular service more than a decade earlier. The mountain rescue team still inspected it once each autumn. It held a wood stove, an emergency radio, and enough supplies to keep a small group alive overnight if weather made better plans impossible. Ethan had repaired its generator 2 winters ago. The shepherd stopped beside a fallen spruce blocking part of the trail. Snow had gathered across its branches, but beneath the trunk he saw the compressed marks of a small tracked vehicle. Recent. Someone had passed this way before the tree came down. The dog squeezed beneath the lower branches. Ethan climbed over. "Of course you're smaller than you look." She glanced back with an expression that suggested his limitations were not her responsibility. By the time Bellwatch appeared through the trees, dusk had settled fully across the valley. The hut stood on a shelf of stone beneath a white ridge, its dark timber walls half buried by drifting snow. A bronze bell hung from a frame beside the roofline, motionless under a cap of ice. No smoke rose from the chimney, yet a faint vibration reached Ethan through the door. A generator running badly. The shepherd climbed the steps and scratched once at the wood. Not frantic, certain. Ethan tried the handle. Unlocked. Inside, the air smelled of kerosene, old timber, damp wool, and photographic chemicals. A weak electric bulb burned over the main room. Supply shelves lined one wall. A narrow cot had been unfolded near the cold stove. On the floor stood 2 sealed archival cases, a canvas camera bag, and 3 red fuel cans. 2 were empty. The generator coughed beneath the floorboards. "Hello?" Ethan called. A strip of red light glowed beyond the old weather room at the back. The shepherd moved toward it. A woman stepped into the doorway before Ethan reached the curtain. She was tall enough to seem imposing despite the slightness of her frame. Gray hair fell to her shoulders, unevenly tied back with a narrow strip of leather. A burgundy scarf wrapped once around the neck of a slate fleece vest. Her face was long and pale, the cheekbones sharp beneath sleepless eyes. She held a folded camera tripod horizontally across her body. It was not much of a weapon. She held it as if dignity might improve its chances. "You need to leave," she said. Her voice was controlled, but one hand trembled against the tripod leg. Ethan stopped several feet away. "Your generator's running on fumes." "I know. The lower trail is blocked." "I know that, too." "Then we're making good progress." The woman's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" "Ethan Duvall, Utility Cooperative." "I didn't call the cooperative." "No." He looked down at the German shepherd. "She did." The woman's gaze followed his. The tripod lowered. For several seconds she did not breathe visibly. The dog walked past Ethan into the red light. Her gait changed as she crossed the room, not faster, but softer, as though some old command within her had finally been released. The woman sank to one knee. She did not reach over the dog's head. She turned one hand upward and waited. The shepherd stepped close and placed her muzzle into the open palm. "Fable?" the woman whispered. The name broke on the second syllable. Fable closed her eyes. Ethan had seen reunions before, loud ones, desperate ones, people colliding with the living proof that loss had made a mistake. This was quieter. The woman bowed over the old dog without gripping her, one hand resting along the side of Fable's neck where the harness had rubbed the fur thin. The shepherd leaned into her with the careful weight of something remembering safety, but no longer trusting memory to remain. Ethan turned his attention to the room. Inside the red-lit chamber, strips of developed film hung from clips above a table. Most of the photographs were stored properly in archival sleeves and sealed boxes. Topographic maps covered one wall. Several images of worker housing had been pinned beside enlargements of snow fences, slope markers, service roads, and retaining structures. The woman rose slowly. "My name is Celeste Ward." Her hand remained on Fable's shoulder. Ethan recognized the name, not personally, but from older rescue reports. Celeste Ward had photographed winter terrain for county crews, avalanche teams, and regional search units. 8 years ago, after a fatal incident near Whitewater Pass, her name had vanished from the reports. "You worked with her," Ethan said. "With Fable and Mara Ellison." The second name carried more weight. Celeste looked toward the western window. Wind pushed snow against the glass with a dry whisper. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "Mara died on this mountain," she said. "Afterward, I left the team. Fable was transferred to Cascade Working Dog Trust. 2 years ago, they told me she'd been placed with a retired handler in Utah." Fable pressed closer to her leg. Celeste looked down at the torn harness. "They lied," she said, though grief rather than anger shaped the words. "Or lost track. That is what organizations call it when neglect has stationary." The generator stumbled again. Ethan crouched near the access panel and listened. "You've got maybe 40 minutes before the fuel line pulls air." I plan to leave this afternoon. The tree came down after you arrived. Celeste nodded. The low trail was passable this morning. The ridge route is still open. But you didn't take it. Her gaze moved to him, suddenly sharp. Ethan did not soften the observation or press it further. Behind Celeste, pinned among the photographs, was an image of an open ridge under blowing snow. Nothing in the picture was visibly threatening, yet Celeste had placed it face down beneath another print, as though even paper could expose too much sky. Fable went for help, Ethan said. Celeste gave a small, humorless smile. Fable always understood assignments better than people. Ethan opened one fuel can and found less than a gallon remaining. I can get the generator stable, then we take the lower trail back. I'm not leaving the negatives. Then we carry them. You don't understand what they are. No, Ethan said. But I understand temperature, fuel, and nightfall. Celeste studied him for a long moment. Fable crossed the narrow space between them and sat beside Ethan's boot. Not touching, simply present. It felt less like trust than a decision made on his behalf. Celeste looked at the dog, then at the archival cases. I don't need you to rescue me, Mr. Duvall. Good. I need you to understand that before you decide what happens next. Ethan set the fuel can beside the generator hatch. Celeste turned one of the pinned images toward him. It showed Whitewater Row beneath a steep white slope, the worker housing compressed against the mountain, as if the snow were already descending toward the roofs. Red warning signs stood beside a damaged retaining wall. The image looked convincing. Then Celeste placed an uncropped print next to it. The red signs belonged to a temporary equipment test far beyond the housing line. The retaining wall was intact. A wide reinforced snow barrier, removed entirely from the published frame, stood between the slope and the homes. Silver Meridian submitted the first version to the county, she said. They want Whitewater Row classified as a red-level geological hazard. Ethan knew what that classification meant. Evacuation, lease termination, conditional development rights activated before the people living there had somewhere affordable to go. Celeste rested her hand on the second photograph. These images are being used to move more than 100 year-round workers out of this valley. Fable sat between them, her notched ear angled toward Celeste's voice. Ethan looked from the altered photograph to the original. A machine failed when a part weakened. A system could fail while every part claimed it was functioning exactly as designed. Celeste met his eyes. Fable didn't bring you here because I was stranded, she said. She brought you because someone has learned how to make a lie look like winter. By morning, Bellwatch Hut had changed from a refuge into a workroom. Ethan had stabilized the generator, cleared the fuel line, and coaxed heat from the old iron stove before sunrise. The practical tasks had occupied his hands, but not his mind. Every few minutes his attention returned to the two photographs Celeste had placed side by side the night before. The altered image still looked convincing. That bothered him more than an obvious lie would have. A crude deception invited suspicion. This one had been built from accurate pieces: real snow, real roofs, a real mountain, a real warning sign, then arranged until the truth pointed in the wrong direction. Celeste worked at the long table beneath the red lamp. She wore thin cotton gloves while moving negatives from one archival sleeve to another. Fable rested nearby on a folded blanket, no longer pressed against Celeste's leg, but close enough that one front paw touched the hem of her slate vest whenever the woman shifted. Ethan set 3 mugs beside the stove. Celeste glanced over. There are only 2 people here. The third is for the deputy. You called law enforcement before asking me. I called 1 deputy. That distinction is doing ambitious work. Ethan handed her a mug. Rena knows how to arrive without bringing a parade. Celeste accepted the coffee but did not drink. And what did you tell her? That I found altered images tied to a county hazard report. You found photographs. I found two versions of the same place. That is not the same thing as proving fraud. Her tone was not defensive. It was exact. Ethan had spent enough years around damaged equipment to recognize when pressure was being released slowly to keep something from rupturing. He pulled a chair toward the table. Then show me the difference. Celeste watched him for a moment, perhaps deciding whether his question was sincere. Then she switched on a second lamp. The white light revealed a wide print of Whitewater Row taken from the southern service slope. The worker housing spread across the lower valley in long, weathered buildings painted green, blue, and faded red. Snow rested heavily on the roofs, but the access lanes were cleared. A concrete retaining wall ran behind the homes. Above it stood steel snow fencing, and 3 reinforced barriers stepped into the slope. Celeste placed the report image beside it. The second photograph had been cropped vertically. Most of the retaining wall was gone. The angle compressed the mountain behind the buildings, making the slope appear to lean over the roofs. A red warning sign stood near the foreground. Same location? Ethan asked. Same hillside, different focal length, different position, different purpose. She tapped the original image. This was taken at 50 millimeters. It reflects the spatial relationship reasonably well. Her finger moved to the report version. This one was taken with a long lens from farther down the road. The compression makes distant objects appear closer together. So the camera lies? No, Celeste's answer came sharply. People lie. Cameras obey. Fable lifted her head at the change in Celeste's voice. Celeste exhaled and removed her gloves. A lens makes choices visible. That is not deception by itself. The deception begins when someone hides the choices. She showed Ethan the lower corner of the original frame. A temporary marker identified a snow load equipment test. In the report image, the marker had been cropped out, leaving only the red warning sign. They moved the sign? Possibly. Or they photographed it from an angle where its actual purpose disappeared. That sounds like a polite way of saying they staged it. It sounds like what I can prove. The distinction irritated him, not because she was wrong, but because she was careful in a way that made anger feel clumsy. Celeste pulled another folder from the archival case. Inside were images of cracked siding, bent gutters, an ice-damaged stair rail, and a service road covered by drifting snow. Some of these are real maintenance problems, she said. Whitewater Row is old. The heating system needs replacement. 2 roofs should have been repaired last summer. The drainage channel near Building C freezes every February. Then Silver Meridian didn't invent everything. That is why the report works. Celeste sat back. If every photograph were false, the document would collapse under one inspection. Instead, it uses real neglect to support a conclusion the evidence does not justify. Ethan studied a close-up of a fractured concrete surface. What is that? A loading platform behind the old kitchen warehouse. The report calls it a residential foundation. Yes? He looked again. Without context, the distinction was impossible to see. How many people know that? Anyone who has worked there long enough. Very few people reviewing county paperwork. The wind moved over Bellwatch's roof in a low rush. Celeste's left hand tightened around her mug. Fable rose without hurry and repositioned herself between Celeste and the western window. She did not touch the woman. She simply blocked the direct line of sight to the bright slope beyond the glass. Ethan noticed Celeste's shoulders lower by a fraction. He said nothing. A vehicle engine sounded faintly below the hut. Celeste turned toward him. That had better be your discreet deputy. It is. You can identify a vehicle through a wall? Rena's front suspension squeaks on left turns. Celeste stared at him. It needs work, he added. Rena Cobb entered 6 minutes later, carrying a dark green case and a paper sack from the bakery. Snow dusted the shoulders of her quilted jacket. She was smaller than Celeste had probably expected, with a compact frame, black hair cut in a tapered bob, and a few silver strands showing above her right ear. She set the bakery sack near the stove. I brought breakfast as a gesture of neutrality. Ethan opened it. Cinnamon rolls aren't neutral. They are when no one has been charged. Rena removed her gloves. A brass mechanical pencil rested behind one ear. Her dark eyes moved across the room, taking in the generator, the archival cases, Celeste, Fable, and the photographs without lingering long enough to seem intrusive. Fable watched her but did not rise. Rena crouched sideways several feet away rather than approaching head-on. "You must be the one who found the mechanic," she said. Fable blinked. Ethan handed Rena a mug. She found a more complicated problem. Most dogs do. Celeste did not smile, but some of the resistance in her face eased. Rena began by asking no questions about Silver Meridian. Instead, she asked who had handled the negatives, where they had been stored, whether any had been scanned, copied, mailed, exhibited, licensed, or accessed by another person. Celeste answered carefully. The originals had remained in her possession. Some digital scans had been uploaded years earlier to a commercial archive. Other photographs had been supplied to survey contractors under limited-use agreements. The contractual chain became less clear after 2 mergers and 1 bankruptcy. Rena wrote each answer in a waterproof notebook. "So the images may still be yours," she said, "but the right to reproduce them may belong partly to companies that no longer exist in their original form." Correct. And someone could argue that changes were made under a broad editorial use clause. They could argue it, Celeste said. They would still have to explain the false dates. Rena glanced toward the prints. "Show me." For the next hour, Celeste walked them through 6 image pairs, a snow barrier removed by cropping, an avalanche scar photographed in spring but dated as current winter damage, a maintenance road shown unplowed during a scheduled closure, then described as permanently inaccessible, a group of warning flags placed for a training exercise but presented as evidence of an active hazard perimeter. The most troubling image showed Whitewater Row beneath a broad white slope with no visible protective structures. The caption described the housing as exposed to direct avalanche runout. Celeste produced the original contact sheet. 3 frames before the selected image showed a steel barrier crossing the lower slope. 2 frames after showed a county inspection truck beside it. The chosen frame had been taken through a narrow gap in the trees where both were hidden. Rena's pencil stopped. "That's not proof of intention," she said. Ethan looked at her. "They selected the only frame that erased the protection." "Yes." "And dated it incorrectly." "Yes." "And used it to support emergency classification." "Yes." "Then what would you call that?" "A pattern worth preserving before anyone gets warned to clean their files." The answer changed the room. Until then, Ethan had been thinking about where to carry the photographs. Rena was thinking about how quickly they might disappear elsewhere. She closed her notebook. "I need to document what is here without removing the originals today." Celeste's posture stiffened. "Why not?" "Because if I take them informally, I create a chain of custody problem. If I seize them without authority, I create a larger one. I can photograph the storage conditions, list the materials, record your statement, and contact the county investigator." "The vote is in 9 days, Ethan said." "I know." "Then contact them now." Rena looked at him. It was not a hard look. That made it more effective. You called me because I do not turn concern into theater. Let me remain useful." Ethan leaned back. Fable's tail touched the floor once. Celeste almost smiled into her coffee. Rena moved to the table and photographed each box before Celeste opened it. She included the seals, labels, humidity strips, and handwritten dates. Then she asked Celeste to explain Silver Meridian's legal interest in Whitewater Row. Celeste unrolled a land use map. The housing complex stood on an irregular strip of property originally established through a public-private workforce trust decades earlier. The county retained oversight. A resort holding company owned several buildings. A nonprofit land board controlled the long-term lease. Silver Meridian had purchased conditional development rights, but not full possession. Their agreement activates if the county declares the site uninhabitable under a red-level geological hazard finding, Celeste said. They can then negotiate accelerated redevelopment without maintaining the existing leases. "What happens to the residents?" Rena asked. "They receive temporary relocation assistance." "How much?" Celeste named the figure. Rena looked up. "That would not cover 2 months in this valley." "It might cover 1 month somewhere, 2 hours away." Ethan thought of the pre-dawn shifts at the lift station, the kitchen staff arriving before the first buses, the mechanics answering breakdown calls after midnight. Moving 2 hours away was not relocation. It was a polite form of removal. "How many people?" he asked. 116 adults are listed on the current occupancy record, Celeste said. That does not include seasonal partners staying under informal arrangements. No children? No, the worker lease converted to adult-only occupancy 6 years ago. Rena made a note. Celeste continued. Silver Meridian has not promised replacement housing before demolition. Only priority application once the new development is completed. How long would construction take? 3 years, according to their best estimate. Ethan looked at the glossy rendering clipped to the edge of the map. Glass balconies, heated walkways, luxury units arranged beneath the same mountain the report described as too dangerous for workers. Safe enough after the rents change, he said. Celeste's gaze shifted to him. That is the question, she replied, but it is not yet the proof. The generator cycled down as the battery bank reached full charge. The sudden quiet made the building seem higher on the mountain. A sharp crack sounded outside. Celeste dropped the ruler in her hand. The plastic struck the floor and skidded beneath the table. Her breath stopped. Ethan turned toward the window. A loaded pine branch had broken somewhere beyond the hut. Nothing more. But Celeste had gone pale. Fable stood instantly. She stepped in front of Celeste, not facing the door or the sound, but the woman. Her body formed a dark, steady wall between Celeste and the western glass. Rena did not move closer. Ethan did not tell Celeste she was safe. The phrase would have been inaccurate. Safety was not a switch another person could turn on. Celeste gripped the edge of the table, her eyes fixed on Fable's notched ear. Mara heard the slope fracture before I did, she said, after a long silence. Not the avalanche, the first break beneath the wind slab. Her voice was thin but controlled. Fable was with us. She kept circling back while Mara crossed toward the marker line. I thought Fable was distracted. Mara understood. Celeste's fingers loosened. Afterward, every open ridge felt like a room where something had already decided to happen. Fable leaned one shoulder against her knee. Celeste rested her hand on the dog's back. Ethan had expected an explanation of fear. What Celeste offered instead was a description of memory behaving like terrain, changing the slope beneath a person even when the ground looked level. Rena waited until Celeste's breathing steadied. Can you travel down the lower route if the tree is cleared? She asked. Yes. And the ridge route? Not today. Rena nodded, as if both answers were equally legitimate facts. Ethan understood then why he had called her. She did not confuse limitation with refusal. By early afternoon, they had cataloged 23 negatives, 14 contact sheets, 2 maps, and 4 sets of metadata discrepancies. Rena placed tamper-evident seals across the archival cases, signed the edges, and asked Celeste to countersign. "These stay with you for now," she said. "Do not move them without calling me. Do not scan anything else. Do not contact Silver Meridian. I wasn't planning to send them a holiday card." "Good. Mail can be discoverable." Celeste signed. Ethan looked at the sealed cases. "What happens next?" "I send a preservation notice to the county investigator and request that all related planning records be retained." "That stops the vote?" "No." "Then what does?" "Evidence strong enough that proceeding becomes riskier than waiting." Ethan disliked the answer because it sounded slow. Rena saw that. "You have original images," she said. "That proves context was altered. It does not yet prove who ordered the changes, who knew the dates were false, or whether the county relied on those exact versions." Celeste nodded. "We need the other side of the chain." Rena pointed her pencil toward the wall map. "Vehicle logs, weather records, maintenance schedules, access permissions, people who were physically present." Ethan followed the line of the pencil from Bellwatch to Whitewater Row, then to the lift stations, the maintenance depot, and the cooperative yard. The mountain was full of records. Most of them belonged to people no one invited into planning meetings. "Saul keeps vehicle assignments," he said. "The lift operation keeps wind closures," Celeste added. "County roads logs plowing and avalanche control," Rena said. "The housing maintenance contractor should have repair inspections." Ethan looked toward Fable. The old shepherd had returned to her blanket. For the first time since he had entered Bellwatch, she was lying with her back partly turned toward the door, not relaxed, but less divided between two worlds. Rena zipped her case. "We do not need to prove a photograph is capable of misleading," she said. "Everyone already knows that, even when they pretend otherwise." She looked at the altered image beside the original. "We need to prove someone built this report backward." "Backward?" Ethan asked. "Starting with the conclusion, then selecting whatever made it look inevitable." Outside, sunlight crossed the ridge and filled the hut with hard winter brightness. The red lamp went pale against it. Celeste began covering the photographs one by one. Ethan helped without being asked. The work was careful and slow. Each image slid into darkness, but the things inside them had become harder to hide. Before they left, Ethan paused beside the photograph of Whitewater Row. The worker housing looked small beneath the mountain. Not worthless, not doomed. Simply easy to describe from far away by people who did not live there. He lifted the archival cover and placed it over the frame. "If they built the report backward," he said, "we follow it in the other direction." Rena opened the door to the cold. To the people who know what was actually there. Fable rose and stood beside Celeste. This time, when the wind entered the hut, Celeste did not step away from the window. She looked through it toward the valley below. The records room at San Juan Utility Cooperative had no window, no proper ventilation, and no respect for chronology. Ethan stood in the doorway with one hand on the light switch, while the fluorescent tubes flickered themselves awake above shelves packed with service binders, fuel receipts, inspection cards, old route maps, and cardboard boxes labeled in Saul's handwriting. Some labels were useful. Others read things like important winter parts, maybe taxes, and do not throw out until we remember why. Saul entered behind him carrying 2 mugs of coffee and wearing the expression of a man returning to the scene of a paperwork-related crime. "I organized this room once," he said. "When?" "Emotionally, several times." Ethan took one of the mugs. Fable waited outside the threshold. She had accepted the workshop more easily than enclosed storage rooms, but she still preferred open sight lines. Her old rescue harness had been removed for cleaning, leaving the fur along her shoulders visibly flattened where the straps had rested for years. She lay beside the doorway with her head raised, able to see both men and the main bay beyond them. Celeste sat at the workbench in the next room, examining contact sheets beneath a portable light panel. She had come down from Bellwatch after Ethan and Saul cleared the fallen spruce from the lower trail. She had agreed to leave the original negatives sealed under Rena's documentation, but brought digital reference copies and a list of dates. The task sounded simple. Find out which cooperative vehicles had entered the survey areas on those dates. By noon, Ethan had remembered that records were machines built from human habits, and human habits rarely came with replacement diagrams. He opened a binder marked North Service Routes, Year 4. Year 4 of what? Saul looked over his shoulder. The current filing system. When did it begin? I was hoping the binder would tell us. Ethan stared at him. Saul sipped his coffee. Hostility will not improve the archives. They began with routine maintenance. Whitewater Row appeared more often than the county report suggested. Generator checks every 6 weeks. Drainage inspections after major storms. Retaining wall surveys in spring and autumn. Snow fencing repaired twice in 3 years. The southern access lane had been cleared regularly except during controlled closures. Yet the Silver Meridian report described several of those areas as neglected, inaccessible, or outside active maintenance coverage. Ethan laid the records across a folding table. This road was serviced 11 times last winter. Saul leaned closer. 12. You missed the emergency call after the February ice storm. The report says seasonal access only. Maybe their seasons are shorter. Ethan did not answer. The more records they found, the less the report looked mistaken. Not false in every detail. Celeste had been right about that. The buildings were old. Some repairs had been delayed. The cooperative had patched systems that should eventually have been replaced. But old had become abandoned. Needs work had become uninhabitable. Temporarily closed had become inaccessible. Language had done what snow did to a road, covered every familiar marker until people forgot something solid still existed underneath. Near 1 o'clock, Saul found the vehicle transfer form. He had been kneeling beside a lower shelf, sorting through a box of dispatch slips, when his usual running commentary stopped. Ethan noticed the silence before he noticed the paper. Saul stood slowly. The form was pale yellow, creased across the middle, with a carbon copy attached behind it. At the top, someone had typed the date Celeste had provided for 3 of the disputed photographs. The listed vehicle was Unit 7, a tracked utility carrier equipped for steep maintenance roads. Ethan read the recipient line. Temporary field access. Geological safety survey. The approval reference listed Nolan Price. At the bottom, beneath the equipment checklist, was Saul's signature. The letters leaned forward with the same careless confidence Saul used when signing deliveries, payroll, birthday cards, and apologies he did not fully intend. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Fable rose in the doorway. Saul lowered himself onto an overturned crate. I remember them. Ethan kept looking at the page. Who? 3 people, 2 men and a woman. Silver Meridian jackets, clean boots, expensive gloves. Saul rubbed the red bandana around his wrist with his thumb. They had a printed authorization. Price's name, resort letterhead, safety access code. You verified the code? I called the resort operations desk. And? They confirmed a survey team was expected. Who confirmed it? Saul's jaw shifted. I don't remember. Ethan looked up. The disappointment reached his face before he could decide what to do with it. Saul saw it. They had the right documents, he said. They had documents. I checked the obvious things. You let a commercial survey group take a tracked vehicle onto restricted maintenance ground. Because they were presented as a safety team. Without calling me. You were in Durango rebuilding the county plow transmission. You could have waited. They said the weather window was closing. Ethan placed the form flat on the table with more care than it deserved. Saul gave a short laugh with no humor in it. There it is. What? That look? Ethan's voice lowered. What look? The one where every mistake becomes evidence that you should have been in the room. I didn't say that. You never have to. The fluorescent lights hummed above them. Saul stood, his broad shoulders stiff beneath his gray work vest. You think if you had taken the call, checked the form, inspected the truck, walked them up the mountain, and held the camera yourself, none of this would have happened. I think we loaned them the machine they used. We? You signed for the cooperative. I signed my name. That distinction won't matter to the county. Saul flinched so slightly that another man might have missed it. Ethan did not. For a moment, he wanted to pull the sentence back. Instead, he folded his arms. Saul looked toward the open bay where Celeste sat beneath the light panel. You know what your real problem is? Ethan said nothing. You arrive when something breaks, decide which piece failed, replace it, and leave before the rest of us have to live with the repair. That has nothing to do with this. It has everything to do with this. Saul tapped the transfer form. I made a mistake. I'll say that to Rena. I'll say it to the county, but you don't get to stand there pretending responsibility only belongs to the person holding the pen. The words settled harder than accusation because Saul was not trying to win. He was trying to remain Ethan's friend while refusing to be reduced to a defective component. Fable stepped into the records room. She did not approach Saul or Ethan. She moved between them and lay down beside the yellow transfer form, her body turned toward the open workshop. Saul looked at her. At least someone here understands workplace mediation. Ethan uncrossed his arms. He picked up the form. We copy it before Rena takes the original. It was not an apology. Saul accepted it as the only bridge currently available. For the record, he said, I still think the filing system performed heroically. By mid-afternoon, they had built a preliminary timeline. Unit 7 left the cooperative yard at 8:12 a.m. The resort operations desk recorded the team entering the north maintenance gate at 8:41. The vehicle returned shortly after 4 with 38 additional miles, mud packed beneath the rear tread and one missing tie-down strap. Saul found another detail on the damage note. Portable signage rack, he read. Ethan looked at him. What signage? It says the rack came back bent. The cooperative doesn't own a portable signage rack. No. Celeste had crossed from the workbench. She studied the note over Saul's shoulder. The report photographs show freestanding warning boards, she said. Not county signs, temporary ones. Saul's face hardened. I thought the rack belonged to the survey crew. It probably did, Ethan said. Celeste looked from the transfer form to the service records. This establishes access, not staging. Not yet, Ethan replied. The next records would not be found in the cooperative. They would be carried in people. Loretta Vance worked in the main kitchen at North Ridge Resort, though worked was too small a word for what she did there. She moved through the room as if conducting an orchestra that had been issued knives, steam, and insufficient time. Her dark red hair was twisted into a high knot. A mustard-colored scarf was tied beneath the collar of her cream chef's jacket, and a green apron covered most of her sturdy frame. When Ethan entered with Celeste and Fable, Loretta was correcting 3 trays of bread rolls that had committed some offense against structure. She glanced at the dog first. "So this is Fable?" Ethan stopped. "How do you know her name?" "Alder Basin has 6,000 residents and no meaningful resistance to gossip." Fable stood beside Ethan, evaluating the kitchen. Steam fogged the lower windows. Stock simmered in steel pots. Coats belonging to the morning crew hung beside the service door, dripping snowmelt into a cracked plastic tray. Loretta pointed beneath a prep table. "She can lie there. No one reaches for her. Anyone who drops onions near her answers to me." Fable inspected the offered place, then settled where she could see both doors. Loretta turned back to Ethan. "You have 5 minutes before dinner prep becomes a constitutional emergency." Celeste spread a copy of the Whitewater Row occupancy map on a stainless table. "We need to understand who lives in these buildings." Loretta's expression changed, not into surprise, into caution. "Why?" Ethan explained the proposed red-level classification, the conditional development rights, and the altered images. Loretta listened without interrupting. When he finished, she dried her hands and opened a small notebook bound in green cloth. The pages held names, apartment numbers, work shifts, dietary needs, emergency contacts, and notes written in compact blue ink. "This one," she said, tapping Building A, "has 2 lift mechanics on alternating night calls. One uses the ground floor unit because his ankle never healed properly." Her finger moved. "Building B has 4 kitchen workers who share rides because the first bus does not arrive before prep shift. Building D has a snowmaker paying off surgery and a laundry supervisor who cannot climb the north staircase when it ices." Celeste looked at the notebook. "You keep all this?" "I feed them. People tell cooks things they won't tell managers." Loretta continued through the list. Some residents had lived there for 15 years. Others arrived each winter and stayed because permanent rent elsewhere was impossible. Then she closed the notebook. "But do not make the mistake of deciding everyone wants to save Whitewater Row." Ethan frowned. "The buildings need work," Loretta said. "The boiler fails every February. Windows leak. Management has promised roof replacements 3 summers in a row. Silver Meridian won't replace them with affordable units." "No, but some people are tired enough to believe any change might be better than another patch." Celeste leaned against the table. "Even if they are displaced first?" "Hope is not always intelligent. It is still real." Loretta looked toward the line cooks moving behind them. "Some want to fight. Some want guarantees. Some want a job in the new development. Some will sign whatever keeps their next paycheck intact." The community Ethan had imagined as a single endangered block divided into individual lives before him. Not united, not helpless, complicated enough to deserve being asked. Celeste lifted her camera. Loretta raised one hand. "No sad faces beside cracked walls." "I wasn't planning that." "Good. Take Omar's hands while he portions dough. Take June's boots by the freezer. Take the night coats by the door." Celeste studied her. "You want portraits?" "I want proof that buildings do not keep mountains running." She glanced down at Fable. "People do." The first photograph Celeste took was not of a face. It was Loretta's green notebook, resting beside a flour-dusted hand. Later, in the lift operations building, Jasper Molina made them wait until the afternoon wind report was completed. He was 45, lean, with closely cropped black hair and the permanent squint of a man accustomed to judging distance through snow. His dark uniform sweater was zipped to the throat, and a ring of access keys hung from his belt. Fable sat beside the window, overlooking the silent upper cables. Jasper recognized her harness from Celeste's photographs. "I remember the old Whitewater search team," he said. "She was younger." "So were all of us," Celeste replied. Jasper produced the wind and shutdown logs. On the date printed in Silver Meridian's report, sustained ridge winds had exceeded operational limits before sunrise. All public lifts closed. North Service access was restricted to tracked vehicles with authorization. No survey crew could have gone up normally, Ethan asked. Not by lift, not on foot, unless they wanted to become a recovery problem. Jasper found the gate record for Unit 7. His face tightened. They used the cooperative carrier. Saul signed it out, Ethan said. Jasper looked toward the glass. Silver Meridian says the new development will keep a technical team year-round. You believe them? I believe they might. That isn't the same answer. No, Jasper said. It is the answer people give when their mortgage does not accept principals. He agreed to copy the logs, but would not sign a formal statement yet. Ethan felt impatience rise. Celeste spoke before he could. What would you need before you signed? Jasper considered the question. Proof that speaking will not simply kill the project and leave the old housing to rot. It was not cowardice. That would have been easier for Ethan to dismiss. It was the fear of choosing between an unjust future and an inadequate present. Fable crossed the small room and sat near Jasper's chair. He looked down at her, then removed one glove and rested his hand on his own knee, allowing her to decide whether to approach. She sniffed his fingers once. Nothing miraculous happened. Jasper still did not sign. But he gave them certified copies of the operational logs and the name of the dispatcher who had approved Unit 7 through the resort gate. That evening, Celeste photographed the workshop as the mountain light faded. She photographed Saul's hands holding the transfer form. She photographed grease beneath Ethan's fingernails, coats drying above the floor drain, a mechanic's cracked thermos, and Fable lying beneath the workbench while sparks from a grinder briefly lit the room. No one posed. The photographs were not evidence of innocence. They were evidence of presence. Rena arrived after dark with confirmation from the county records office. Nolan Price had signed the survey authorization, but he had no authority to requisition cooperative equipment. The document had been routed through a resort safety account, making the request appear to be part of an approved mountain risk operation. Rena laid the copied authorization beside Saul's transfer form. Someone used the resort's name to turn a private development survey into a safety assignment. Saul stared at his signature. Ethan looked at the root code. The deception had not begun with a camera. It had begun earlier in the language that opened a gate. Fable rested her chin on her paws beneath the table while the four adults studied the paperwork. Outside, the lift towers blinked red against the dark mountain. Kitchen lights glowed below them. Snowcats moved along the upper ridge. Boilers ran in Whitewater Row. The mountain looked asleep from a distance. Up close, hundreds of people were keeping it alive. And somewhere among their logs, memories, signatures, and compromises, was the hand that had decided their homes would be easier to take if the theft could first be called safety. Miriam Solis kept her office above a pharmacy in downtown Alder Basin, where the windows looked toward the courthouse rather than the mountains. Ethan noticed that immediately. Most offices in town displayed the ridges as if beauty were a professional credential. Miriam's room faced brick walls, utility lines, a loading alley, and the rear entrance of a bakery. It was a view of how a town functioned when no one was photographing it. Miriam sat behind a narrow oak desk surrounded by labeled file boxes. At 64, she carried herself with a stillness that made the room seem louder around her. Her silver hair ended cleanly at her jaw, and red wine glasses rested low on her nose as she read Rena's preliminary report. A brass swallow held several documents together near her hand. Fable lay beside Celeste's chair, wearing no rescue harness now, only a temporary brown leather collar Delia March had fitted at the veterinary clinic. The old harness rested inside Ethan's canvas bag. Celeste had not wanted to throw it away, but neither had she wanted the damaged straps rubbing Fable's shoulders again. Miriam turned one page. "So far," she said, "you have evidence that photographs were presented without accurate context, access records showing a private survey team used restricted equipment, and operational data contradicting portions of the report." "That sounds like enough," Ethan said. "It sounds like enough to ask better questions." Her voice was soft, almost pleasant. It made disagreement feel less like a collision and more like discovering the floor had shifted beneath one's chair. Celeste sat with both hands around a paper cup she had not touched. "What is missing? Knowledge and intention?" Miriam removed her glasses. "We need to connect the people who selected the images to the fact that those images did not represent current conditions. Otherwise, Silver Meridian will describe the problems as editorial errors, inherited metadata, or overbroad language from a subcontractor." "They remove safety structures from the frame," Ethan said. "They chose a frame where the structures were not visible. They changed dates. They may claim the dates were attached by software. They used a loading platform crack as a residential foundation failure. And they will say the captioning team misunderstood the location." Ethan leaned back. Miriam looked at him without impatience. A bad explanation is still an explanation until evidence makes it impossible. Rena stood near the filing cabinet, turning her brass mechanical pencil between her fingers. She had brought them to Miriam because the next stage required someone who understood not only what public agencies should do, but what they could be compelled to do when they preferred waiting. "There is one person who may help," Miriam said. Celeste's eyes narrowed. "May?" "She has documents. Whether she can legally provide them and whether she is willing to explain them under oath are separate questions." The woman arrived 10 minutes later, carrying a dark blue accordion file against her chest. Maribel Knox was 52, slender, with warm brown skin and dark curls threaded with silver, gathered into a low knot. Her plum-colored coat was still dusted with snow. She paused inside the doorway as though checking whether leaving would be easier before the door fully closed. Miriam rose to greet her. No one used the word whistleblower. Ethan sensed that was deliberate. Maribel sat at the end of the table and placed the file in front of her without opening it. A thin gold chain disappeared beneath her teal cardigan. Something small hung from it, perhaps a key or a flash drive. "I did not steal company records," she said. Miriam nodded. "Tell us what you retained." "Copies of correspondence attached to approval logs I was required to audit. Document versions sent through my queue. Notes concerning metadata corrections." Maribel's mouth tightened. "The company policy required retention for regulatory review. Then the company changed owners, and everyone began acting as though policies had expired with the letterhead." "You worked for Nolan Price?" Rena asked. "I coordinated records for his consulting firm. I did not report to him directly, though he behaved as if everyone did." Her answer carried no dramatic hatred, only fatigue sharpened by 6 months of reconsidering old decisions. Maribel opened the accordion file. The documents were not secret maps or unsigned confessions. They were ordinary printouts, revision requests, distribution lists, approval notes, image inventories. That ordinariness made Ethan uneasy. Serious harm, he had learned, often traveled in folders no one thought worth hiding. Maribel placed an email on the table. The message came from Nolan Price to the report design team. The language was polished and careful. Prioritize frames that communicate immediate exposure. Avoid images likely to confuse reviewers with secondary mitigation infrastructure. Historical imagery may be used where it illustrates continuing risk patterns. Ethan read it twice. Secondary mitigation infrastructure, he said. He means the barriers. Yes, Maribel replied. and historical imagery means old photographs presented as current. Not necessarily. That is why the phrasing mattered. She pulled out another page. This one contained an editorial note beside several file numbers. Exclude frames 14 to 19. Reinforcement structures visually dilute urgency. Celeste went completely still. Fable lifted her head. Maribel noticed the dog for the first time, or perhaps only then allowed herself to look directly. Her expression softened briefly. "You found her," she said to Celeste. "She found us," Celeste replied. Maribel lowered her eyes to the files again. "I objected to that note. I wrote that mitigation structures were part of the site condition and could not be omitted from a safety summary." "What happened?" Rena asked. "The objection was marked addressed." "Was it?" "No." Maribel pushed forward a final printout. Her original comment had been removed from the approved version. Beside the deletion was Nolan's authorization code. The room grew quiet. They had found what Miriam said they needed, not proof of every decision, but evidence that someone had been warned that the images omitted relevant protections and approved the omission anyway. Ethan expected relief. Instead, Maribel looked ashamed. "I left 6 months ago," she said. "I should have left sooner." Miriam folded her hands. "Why did you stay?" "Health insurance, a mortgage, my mother's assisted living payments." Maribel spoke plainly, refusing either excuse or punishment. "And because each individual decision was small enough to survive one more week." Her fingers rested on the accordion file. One caption, one deleted note, one request to use stronger images. None of it looked like the moment a person should destroy her career. By the time I understood the shape of it, my silence was already part of the shape. Ethan thought of Saul's signature. Responsibility, it seemed, rarely arrived whole. It accumulated in pieces people could still carry without dropping anything. Celeste reached for one of the image inventories. Her hand stopped halfway. The number printed beside the strongest avalanche photograph had caught her attention. CW-08-117. She withdrew her hand as if the paper had become hot. Miriam noticed. "Do you recognize it?" Celeste did not answer. Fable rose and pressed her shoulder against Celeste's knee. Ethan had seen Celeste frightened by wind, open ridges, and the sound of snow shifting. This was different. There was no panic in it, only resistance. The kind that came when a person had spent years building a door and suddenly heard someone knocking from inside. "That photograph is mine," Celeste said. "We know several are yours," Miriam replied. "No, that one." Celeste stood and walked to the office window. The alley below was filled with bright winter light reflected from the pharmacy roof. There was no mountain in view, yet she kept her back to the room. "I took it 8 years ago." Rena opened her notebook but did not write. Celeste continued. "Mara and I were documenting an old avalanche track above Whitewater Pass. The county had installed temporary markers while engineers planned the first reinforcement barrier." Her voice remained steady because she had made it narrow enough to fit through. "The storm arrived earlier than forecast. A wind slab fractured above the marker line. Mara crossed to check a remote sensor before we withdrew." Fable stood behind her, waiting. She did not come back. No one interrupted. Ethan looked at the report photograph again. The white mass descending behind the worker housing had seemed anonymous when he first saw it, a dramatic example of winter risk. Now it had a date, a voice behind the camera, a person outside the frame. Celeste returned to the table and placed both palms on its edge. "The photograph is real. That avalanche happened." Maribel's face changed. The report identifies it as a current slope event. It was not current, and it was not taken from Whitewater Row. Celeste asked Miriam for a blank sheet of paper and sketched the ridge, the old runout path, and the camera position. After Mara's death, the county had extended the barrier system and redirected the lower channel. Later photographs showed those improvements. The report had used the historic avalanche image, altered its date, and paired it with a caption implying the present-day housing sat directly beneath the same unmitigated track. "Why did Silver Meridian have access to it?" Ethan asked. Celeste's gaze lowered. 4 years after Mara died, I licensed part of my archive to a regional image library, limited editorial use, environmental publications, training materials. I needed money, and I told myself the photographs should still be useful. "Silver Meridian bought the library?" Rena asked. "Not directly. The library was acquired by a media group. The media group sold a commercial package to a survey publisher. The publisher subcontracted image services to Nolan's firm." Celeste touched the inventory number. "They may have had a reproduction license. They never had permission to change what the image claimed to show." "But you gave the photograph to the chain," Ethan said. It was the wrong sentence. He knew it before Celeste looked at him. "I opened the first door," she replied. "That isn't what I meant." "It is what I meant." The shame in her voice angered him, not at her, but at the fact that she had been carrying it alone. His instinct was immediate and familiar. Remove the dangerous portion. Use the technical evidence. Protect Celeste from becoming part of the argument. "We don't have to use that image publicly," he said. "Maribel's emails may be enough to challenge the report. We can focus on the false date and the barrier records without describing Mara." Celeste stared at him. "You want to crop her out again?" "No." "You want the evidence without the part that hurts." "I want to keep them from turning your grief into a spectacle." "And who asked you to decide what I can survive?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "I'm trying to protect you." "From what? My own photograph?" "From a room full of people questioning why you licensed it." "They will question it." "They will blame you." "They may." "And you are willing to hand them that?" Celeste stepped closer. "What you call protection often looks very much like control from the other side." The words landed without volume, but they struck the oldest habit in him. Ethan had spent years believing that reducing damage was always the clearest form of care. Remove the unstable part, lower the pressure, keep the wounded person away from whatever might open the injury again. Celeste was telling him that a person could be protected so completely she disappeared from her own story. Fable moved from Celeste to Ethan. She stood between them for a moment, then turned back toward Celeste and sat beside her left leg, not choosing one person over another, clarifying where support was needed. Ethan looked at the dog, then at the historic photograph. "What do you need?" he asked. Celeste's face remained guarded. "Not what do you want me to prevent," he added. "What do you need?" The room held still around the question. Celeste looked down at Fable. "When I explain the photograph," she said, "I need someone close enough that I do not leave before I finish." Ethan nodded. "I can do that. I do not need you to speak for me. I heard you." This time the nod she gave him was not forgiveness. It was an agreement with terms. Miriam returned the discussion to procedure. Maribel would provide a sworn declaration describing the document workflow, her objections, and Nolan's approval code. Celeste would prepare a separate statement tracing the history and licensing of the avalanche image. Rena would request preservation of the consultant's correspondence, image revision history, and county submission records. The actual signing took place that afternoon in Miriam's conference room. No reporters waited outside. No crowd gathered. Maribel signed first, her hand shaking slightly only after the pen left the page. Celeste sat before the second statement. Fable stood against her chair, one shoulder touching Celeste's calf. Ethan remained on the opposite side of the table, near enough to be seen, but not near enough to crowd her. Celeste read every line. When she reached Mara's name, she stopped. Her fingers closed around the burgundy scarf at her throat. Ethan did not tell her to continue. He did not tell her to rest. Fable pressed closer. Celeste drew one breath and signed. Miriam witnessed both declarations, then sent an emergency preservation request to the county, a petition to postpone the planning vote, and a demand for independent geological review. Rena received the reply from Silver Meridian before they left the building. It was a formal cease and desist letter addressed to Celeste. The company asserted disputed reproduction rights over the images and warned against public display, redistribution, or statements that might damage commercial interests before ownership questions were resolved. Ethan read the last paragraph. They want to stop her from showing her own photograph. Miriam adjusted her glasses. They want to make the cost of showing it feel uncertain. Can they enforce this? They can attempt to. Celeste folded the letter once, then again. Her hands were steady now. They used Mara's last day to argue that other people should lose their homes, she said. They do not get to hide behind ownership after changing what the image means. Miriam placed the cease and desist beside the signed declaration. One document tried to limit what could be shown. The other established why it had to be shown. Outside, snow began falling through sunlight, each flake bright against the brick alley. The dispute was no longer simply about whether a photograph had been edited. It was about who possessed the authority to define its truth. The person who witnessed the moment, the company that licensed the file, the consultant who supplied the caption, or the people whose lives would be rearranged by what the county believed it saw. Celeste slipped the folded letter into her coat. Fable rose beside her. Ethan opened the office door, then stood back, rather than leading the way. Celeste walked through first. The old lift house had once carried skiers uphill. Now it carried folding chairs, extension cords, legal exhibits, soup kettles, and enough anxious people to make the steel beams seem narrower than they were. Weather had forced the county to move the public records hearing out of the municipal building. Snow had closed the western access road, and the council chamber could not hold the number of workers, residents, survey staff, attorneys, and reporters who had asked to attend. So Alder Basin gathered beneath the retired cable machinery. The old bullwheel still hung above the room, black and enormous, its grooves polished by years of vanished cable. Snow pressed against the high windows. Every gust made the sheet metal roof answer with a dull industrial shudder. Ethan arrived before dawn with Saul. They spent 3 hours installing 2 portable heaters, backup lights, and a generator isolated behind a sound barrier Saul built from maintenance panels and a stack of retired seat cushions. "It looks illegal," Ethan said. "It looks warm." "It looks flammable." Saul stepped back and inspected his work. "That is why you are here, to provide emotional support through criticism." Ethan tightened the final connection. Saul's humor was intact, but he had spoken less than usual since signing his sworn statement about Unit 7. The red bandana remained tied around his wrist. Every so often, he touched it with his thumb as though checking that something familiar had not been confiscated with the paperwork. At the far end of the lift house, Loretta Vance had converted an old ticket counter into a soup station. 3 stock pots steamed beneath warming lamps. She had labeled them carefully, beef barley, lentil, and one pot marked, "No questions, just eat." Jasper Molina arranged lift logs across a plywood table in chronological order. He had not yet signed a broad public accusation, but he had agreed to authenticate the wind records and restricted access entries. That distinction mattered to him, and Ethan had learned not to treat distinctions as cowardice simply because they slowed the result he wanted. Rena Cobb moved through the room with numbered evidence seals, a clipboard, and the quiet authority of someone who intended to prevent every dramatic person present from becoming a procedural problem. Celeste worked beneath the old route map. She had mounted each pair of photographs on plain gray boards: original frame, report version, date, location, focal length, caption history, and the missing context. No dramatic titles, no enlarged images of Mara. No attempt to make grief perform for the room. The historic avalanche photograph occupied the final board. Beside it, Celeste had placed a newer image of the same slope, showing the reinforced barrier system and redirected lower channel. Beneath both was one sentence: "A true image can become false when time, place, and consequence are removed." Fable lay near Celeste's chair, wearing a blue-gray thermal coat. Dr. Delia March had insisted on it. Delia herself stood nearby with a veterinary bag at her feet and the expression of a woman prepared to disapprove professionally. At 50, she had a calm, weathered face, dark blonde hair braided over one shoulder, and the practical posture of someone who had spent years kneeling beside frightened animals while their owners explained too much. "She stays no longer than 2 hours without a rest break," Delia told Ethan. "I know." "No crowding." "I know." "No one treats her like an exhibit." "I know." Delia looked at him. "You say that with the injured dignity of a man who dislikes being told the same sensible thing 3 times. 4. Good. You can count under stress." Fable raised her head at Ethan's voice, then lowered it again against Celeste's boot. By 9 o'clock, every chair was filled. Workers stood along the rear wall. Resort supervisors occupied one side aisle. County staff sat behind a row of folding tables near the front. A few visitors wore expensive winter coats and expressions suggesting they had expected civic participation to come with better parking. Nolan Price entered with Avery Sloan. Nolan was in his late 50s, narrow through the shoulders, with carefully trimmed gray hair and a face built for appearing patient with people he considered imprecise. His charcoal overcoat fit perfectly. He carried no visible papers. Avery Sloan carried enough for both of them. At 44, she had the composed, efficient presence of someone accustomed to walking into hostile rooms without surrendering posture. Her black hair was cut just below the jaw, and a pale stone coat framed a dark green suit beneath it. She did not scan the room for enemies. She scanned it for leverage. Ethan disliked her less immediately than he expected. That made him more cautious. The county moderator opened the hearing by clarifying that this was not a trial and not a final zoning vote. The purpose was to receive evidence relevant to the proposed red-level geological classification and determine whether the existing report could support further action. Miriam Solis sat beside Celeste. Her camel coat was folded behind her chair, red wine glasses resting low on her nose. Maribel Knox sat on the other side with the blue accordion file in her lap. The first hour belonged to documents. Rena authenticated the copied materials and described how the original negatives had been cataloged and sealed. She offered no opinion about Silver Meridian's motives. She did not need to. Precision gave the evidence more room than outrage would have. Jasper presented the wind logs. He explained that on the date listed for the disputed survey, ridge winds had exceeded public operating limits. Lift access was closed. Foot travel above the north gate had been prohibited. Only tracked maintenance equipment could have reached the camera positions safely. "Does that prove the photographs were staged?" the moderator asked. "No," Jasper said. "It proves whoever took them used restricted access and knew normal operations were closed." He returned to his seat without looking toward Nolan. Saul went next. He carried the yellow transfer form to the front table and placed it beneath the document camera. His signature filled the screen behind him. For once, he did not make a joke. "I released Unit 7 to the survey team," he said. I believed they were conducting authorized mountain safety work. I confirmed the request through the resort operations desk, but failed to record the name of the person who confirmed it. The moderator asked whether he had inspected the team's equipment. Not beyond the standard load check. Did you see portable warning signs? I saw a folded rack and assumed it belonged to their survey kit. Would you make the same decision today? Saul looked at his signature on the screen. No? The room remained silent as he returned to his chair. Ethan understood then that admission without self-defense possessed a kind of weight evidence could not manufacture. Maribel followed. She explained the document workflow, Nolan's approval code, and the removed objection concerning mitigation structures. Her voice shook in the first minute, then steadied when the questions became technical. Nolan's attorney objected to the interpretation of phrases such as visual urgency and secondary mitigation infrastructure. Miriam did not argue with the objection. She asked Maribel one question. When you warned that excluding the barriers would misrepresent the site condition, was that warning included in the final review record? No. Who authorized its removal? Maribel looked at Nolan. Mr. Price. A murmur moved through the room. Nolan did not react. The hearing paused at noon. Loretta served soup to everyone, including the attorneys. She handed Nolan a bowl of lentil without asking which he preferred. Neutral nourishment, she said. He looked uncertain whether she was being courteous. Ethan knew better. Near the rear door, a kitchen worker named Dean Mercer stood holding a paper cup with both hands. He was in his 40s, tired-eyed, with a black kitchen cap folded into his coat pocket. Ethan had seen him at the resort, but never spoken to him. You live in Whitewater? Ethan asked. Building B? You staying for the afternoon? Dean glanced toward the hearing tables. Depends whether my supervisor calls me back. Why? 2 banquet shifts were removed this morning. Ethan looked across the room toward Avery Sloane. Dean followed his gaze. Not saying she did it, he said. I'm saying my rent is due, whether that report lied or not. Before Ethan could answer, the moderator called everyone back. Celeste's presentation began with the unremarkable photographs. A cracked gutter correctly labeled as a cracked gutter. A drainage channel photographed during freeze-up. A loading platform misidentified as a residential foundation. She explained focal compression, cropping, metadata, and the difference between documenting a hazard and constructing an impression. No one interrupted until she reached the historic avalanche image. Celeste stood beside it. Fable rose with her and leaned lightly against the outside of her left leg. This photograph is real, Celeste said. The room changed. She gave the date, the location, the original assignment. She named Mara Ellison and described the improvements completed after the accident. She also disclosed her licensing agreement and the chain through which the image had entered commercial archives. She did not ask the room to absolve her. I believed correct captions would travel with the image, she said. That belief was careless. Photographs do not preserve their own honesty. People do that, or fail to. Ethan stood near the side wall where Celeste could see him. He did not step forward when her voice tightened. He did not rescue the silence after Mara's name. Celeste finished the statement herself. Nolan was given time to respond. He approached the front without notes. The report was intended to illustrate patterns of risk, he said. It was not a museum catalog. Historical images are commonly used to demonstrate recurring terrain behavior. Miriam looked up. Were they identified as historical? The captions could have been more precise. Were the reinforcement barriers deliberately excluded? The images were selected for clarity. Clarity of what? Exposure. Without the structures reducing that exposure? Nolan's jaw tightened slightly. Avery intervened before the exchange became personal. Silver Meridian does not deny that Whitewater Row requires careful review, she said. Nor do we deny that some editorial choices deserve correction. But the central question remains whether aging housing beneath a known avalanche corridor should continue operating without major investment. Her voice was calm and direct. The proposed development would create construction work, permanent technical positions, improved utilities, and a larger tax base. Delaying it also has consequences. Loretta stood from the rear row. The moderator reminded her that public comments would follow. Loretta held up her green notebook. I brought consequences. When called, she walked to the front and began reading names. Not illnesses for sympathy, not debts for spectacle. Names and work. A night baker who prepared breakfast before the first ski lift opened. 2 mechanics who maintained emergency generators. A laundry supervisor who washed resort linens through every storm. A driver who transported food when the highway closed. A snowmaker who had lived in Whitewater Row for 17 winters. These are not obstacles to development, Loretta said. They are the people development has been standing on. Avery listened without smiling. When Loretta finished, the independent geological engineer presented her review. She was careful not to declare Whitewater Row completely safe. The drainage system required repair. Several structures needed reinforcement. Additional snow load monitoring was warranted. But the existing report did not support red level classification. Its images lacked sufficient temporal disclosure. Its run-out assumptions did not incorporate the current barrier system. Its description of access and maintenance conflicted with operational records. The room did not erupt. People exhaled. The county representative announced a 30-day postponement of the zoning vote and a temporary suspension of relocation action pending a new independent assessment. Ethan expected relief to feel cleaner. It lasted until the next morning. Silver Meridian issued a statement freezing voluntary infrastructure commitments while the project remained under review. The resort reduced projected banquet and housekeeping shifts, citing uncertainty in winter bookings. A regional supplier suspended its discounted equipment leasing program after a development reimbursement failed to arrive. No document called the actions retaliation. No one needed the word to feel the pressure. By afternoon, 3 workers had confronted Ethan outside the cooperative. One said he had done the right thing at the wrong time. Another asked whether Truth would cover the heating bill. Dean Mercer said nothing at all. He stood near the bay door, holding a new schedule with 2 shifts crossed out. Ethan felt anger rise with the clean force of an engine catching. We take this public, he told Celeste. Every contract, every cut shift, we force the county to investigate economic retaliation. Miriam, standing nearby, warned that they did not yet know who had ordered the reductions or whether the changes were legally connected. Ethan barely heard her. Then Fable rose from beside his workbench. She walked past him, past Celeste, past the documents laid out beneath the light. She stopped beside Dean and lowered herself carefully onto the concrete near his boots. Dean looked down. After a moment, he crouched and rested one hand on his own knee. Fable placed her chin there. Nothing about the gesture solved his missing shifts. That was why it mattered. Ethan stood with accusation already formed in his mouth and saw the distance between proving harm and sitting beside the person carrying it. He had been preparing for the next argument. Fable had gone to the consequence. Dean rubbed one thumb along the edge of her thermal coat. I'm not against what you did, he said quietly. I just need you to understand what it costs before you call it a win. Ethan looked at the crossed-out schedule, then at the boxes of evidence. The hearing had stopped one kind of removal. It had not kept anyone warm. He lowered his voice. What do you need first? Dean glanced toward Loretta's soup containers stacked near the office. A full shift would be nice. I can't give you that. No? What can I help with? Dean considered. My truck won't start below 10 degrees. Ethan nodded once. Bring it in. It was a small answer, smaller than exposing a company, smaller than defeating a report. But it belonged to a person standing in front of him. Fable closed her eyes beneath Dean's hand. Outside, the mountains shone under fresh snow, every ridge bright enough to look innocent. Inside the workshop, the truth had won 30 days. Now the people who carried it had to survive them. The storm arrived before the warning finished printing. At 10 in the morning, Alder Basin still held the pale brightness of an ordinary winter day. By 11, the western ridge had disappeared. By noon, snow was moving sideways across Whitewater Row so thickly that street lamps became weak yellow stains in the air. The new geological assessment was still incomplete. That fact ceased to matter when the power began failing. At San Juan Utility Cooperative, the radios came alive all at once. A transformer near Building D had tripped twice. The lower access road was blocked by a cottonwood limb thick enough to crush the guardrail beneath it. The main shelter at the base lodge had reached capacity, and the county plow assigned to Whitewater Row had become stuck near the frozen drainage channel. Ethan stood over the dispatch table wearing his copper-brown rescue shell over the olive combat shirt. Snow melted from the shoulders of volunteers crowding around the room. Captain Audra Keene's voice came through the radio. North Route has a stranded shuttle and 6 adults near the service tunnel. I cannot leave command. Even through static, Audra sounded controlled. At 57, she had led mountain rescues long enough to know urgency did not improve when shouted. Her instructions arrived clipped and precise, each one already stripped of panic. Duvall, you have technical transport. Molina handles headcount. Cobb controls radio traffic. Bellwatch is your secondary shelter if the base station cannot take more. Ethan studied the route map. Bellwatch was not ideal. It sat higher than the crowded base shelter, and the final section required leaving the broad maintenance road. But the old hut had a stove, emergency supplies, a small generator, and enough protected floor space for the group trapped between Whitewater Row and the blocked lower road. How many? Ethan asked. 11 adults confirmed, possibly 13. Jasper stood beside him with a clipboard already divided into names, medical limitations, and vehicle assignments. Rena worked the radio table, one gloved finger tracing call times, while her brass pencil moved across waterproof paper. Loretta entered, carrying 2 insulated food carriers and wearing her red brick parka over kitchen clothes. You are not bringing those, Ethan said. I am bringing soup. You are being evacuated. Exactly. I refuse to be evacuated into a room where someone thinks crackers count as planning. Saul came in behind her with a tool bag over one shoulder. His face looked pale beneath the workshop lights. Ethan noticed. Saul noticed him noticing. Cold air makes me look distinguished. It makes you wheeze. That too. Near the wall, Fable stood in a charcoal green support harness and blue-gray thermal coat. Delia March crouched beside her, checking the straps along the hips. She rides the whole way unless the vehicle cannot continue, Delia said. If she gets out, it is for a short controlled section only. She stays at the cooperative, Ethan replied. Fable looked at him. Delia tightened one strap. She spent the last 20 minutes trying to follow the evacuation team through a closed door. That does not make her cleared. No, I make her cleared. Delia rose and pointed one finger at Ethan. No climbing through deep drifts. No long scent work. No treating her like a piece of rescue equipment because someone remembers what she used to be. Ethan looked down at Fable. The old shepherd's amber eyes remained steady. She rides, he said. Now repeat the rest. Ethan stared at Delia. Humor me. She rides. She is not working. Delia nodded. Good. I will monitor by radio. 20 minutes later, 2 tracked carriers left the cooperative yard. The first held Ethan, Rena, Saul, Loretta, Celeste, Fable, and a lift technician named Martin Vale, who was still recovering from shoulder surgery. The second carried Jasper, 4 workers from Whitewater Row, blankets, fuel, and emergency supplies. Snow erased their tracks almost as soon as the machines made them. The route to the lower junction took twice as long as expected. The first carrier pushed through drifts that rose over the front treads. Wind struck the side panels in hard bursts, making the metal frame groan. Rena relayed updates to Audra, while Jasper's voice came from the second vehicle behind them. 11 confirmed. 2 more sheltering in Building C with neighbors. They are not moving. Copy, Rena answered. 11 with transport team. Ethan kept both hands on the controls. At the first switchback, they passed the fallen cottonwood. Its branches covered most of the lower road. The carriers squeezed along the uphill shoulder, one tread nearly brushing the snow-buried guardrail. Beyond that, the road narrowed. The main shelter radioed that no additional evacuees could be accepted until a bus transferred people downhill. Bellwatch became the only practical destination. Ethan revised the route without hesitation. That was the part of emergency work he understood best. New facts, new plan, no time wasted mourning the old one. The carriers climbed toward the forest shelf below Bellwatch. Then visibility collapsed. The world beyond the windshield turned white from edge to edge. The leading lights reflected off the snow and came back at them. Ethan slowed until the machine barely crawled. Jasper's voice broke through the radio. Second carrier losing traction. Ethan stopped. They found the second vehicle tilted against a drift, its left tread spinning without purchase. No one was injured, but the machine would not climb farther without digging and resetting the track. Bellwatch stood less than half a mile ahead. Ethan looked at the time, the wind speed, and the fuel gauge. They had enough daylight to walk the final section if they moved now. He divided the group. Jasper would take the stronger walkers ahead with Rena and one supply sled. Ethan would remain with Loretta, Saul, Celeste, Martin, and Fable, then bring them through after the lead group marked the safest line. Technically, it was efficient. The first group could start the stove, prepare the hut, and return if necessary. The slower group would avoid standing exposed while everyone moved at one pace. Audra approved the separation with one warning. Maintain visual contact. If visibility drops below 20 yards, reunite immediately. They began moving. At first, Ethan's plan worked. Jasper's group stayed ahead, orange rescue markers visible through the trees. Ethan walked behind the slower group, watching their foot placement and checking the time. Loretta's old knee stiffened in the cold. Saul's breathing grew louder beneath his scarf. Martin carried his recovering arm close to his chest despite the sling beneath his coat. Celeste moved steadily while the route remained among the pines. Fable walked beside her on a short lead attached to the support harness. The old dog's pace was measured but sure. Then the forest thinned. The trail crossed a short exposed shelf before entering the final stand of trees below Bellwatch. It was not a cliff. The slope fell gradually into the valley, but wind had stripped the snow from parts of the ridge and piled it into uneven lips along the edge. Celeste stopped. Jasper's group continued ahead, their shapes fading behind blowing snow. Ethan checked the distance. Keep moving. Celeste did not. Fable pressed against her leg. Celeste, I heard you. Then take the next step. The wind struck the shelf, carrying a low cracking sound from somewhere above. Probably a tree limb, possibly settling snow. Celeste's breathing shortened. Saul stopped behind her. Loretta leaned against one trekking pole. The gap ahead widened. Ethan's radio hissed. Jasper, hold position. No answer. He tried again. Static. Ethan looked toward the fading markers. We need to close the distance. He moved beside Celeste and pointed toward the nearest tree line. 20 yards. We get across, then stop. Celeste's eyes remained fixed on the open slope. "Do not measure it for me. I'm telling you how far. I know how far it is. Then move." The command came from a place older than the cooperative, older than the mountains, a place where hesitation could kill, and authority had to cut through fear before fear became contagious. Celeste looked at him. "You are doing it again." "Doing what?" "Running ahead of everyone's pain and calling it leadership." "This is not the time." "It is exactly the time." Snow gathered in the loose strands of her gray hair. "You keep believing the person who moves fastest has understood the danger best. Standing here is dangerous. So is splitting us until the slowest people cannot see the others." Ethan looked past her. Jasper's last orange marker vanished. Audra's warning returned to him. Maintain visual contact. The condition had changed. Yet part of him still resisted abandoning the plan. Not because it remained best, but because he had chosen it, because changing now meant admitting speed had created a new risk. Fable stepped away from Celeste. For one moment, Ethan expected her to follow the vanished lead group. Instead, she crossed the narrow trail and stood sideways before him. No bark, no growl. Her body simply occupied the path. Behind her, Saul bent forward, one hand braced on his thigh while he caught his breath. Loretta had stopped pretending her knee was merely stiff. Martin's face had gone tight from holding the supply pack with his good arm. Ethan saw them as a group for the first time, not a delay, attached to a mission, the mission itself. He keyed the radio. "Jasper, return to last visual marker. We are recombining." Static answered, then faintly, "Copy." Turning back, Ethan removed the supply bag from Martin's shoulder and opened it. "Leave the spare cable spool." Saul looked at him. "You packed that." "I was optimistic." Historic moment. They redistributed weight. Loretta carried nothing but her poles. Saul gave up half his tool bag after a brief argument in which he accused Ethan of insulting the emotional support value of socket wrenches. Rena and Jasper returned through the snow with the stronger walkers. Ethan paired each slower person with someone who could steady them without pulling. Rena took Martin's free side. Jasper stayed with Loretta. Ethan moved beside Celeste. Fable walked between Celeste and Saul, turning back whenever either fell more than several steps behind. She did not guide the route. She kept the group from stretching beyond itself. They moved at the pace of the slowest person. It felt painfully slow to Ethan. That was how he knew the lesson had reached the right place. The exposed shelf waited ahead. Celeste stopped at its edge again. Ethan stood beside her. He did not tell her the distance. He did not promise safety. He did not reach for her arm. Fable leaned into Celeste's left leg, the support harness dark beneath falling snow. Celeste looked toward the tree line across the shelf. "What happens if I stop halfway?" "We stop with you." Her eyes shifted to Ethan. "All of you? All of us?" Behind them, no one complained. Loretta planted both poles and said, "I have waited longer for onions to caramelize." Saul added, "And with less competent supervision." Celeste breathed once. Then she stepped onto the shelf. They crossed in small increments. Fable stayed close. Ethan matched Celeste's pace rather than setting it. When the wind struck, the entire line stopped together. No one urged, no one passed. On the far side, Celeste placed one gloved hand against a pine trunk and lowered her head. Fable rested beside her boots. The moment held no triumph, only completion. By the time Bell Watch appeared through the trees, the radio had failed almost entirely. The support group approaching from the lower forest could no longer confirm their position. Rena pointed toward the bronze bell above the hut. Celeste looked at Ethan. He waited. She climbed the steps, took the rope in both hands, and pulled 3 short times. The bell answered the storm with a deep, uneven sound. They waited, then repeated the signal. From somewhere below the trees came a faint horn response. The support team had heard. Inside Bellwatch, the temperature was barely above freezing. The generator started, coughed, then died. Ethan removed the fuel filter and found waxy residue clogging the line. Saul knelt beside him, breathing through pursed lips but refusing to sit until the housing was open. Loretta organized the others before either man asked. Wet gloves went near the stove. Blankets were distributed. Soup was warmed over a portable burner. Jasper checked every name against the list twice. Fable lay beside Celeste on a folded blanket. Her breathing was faster than normal. Rena radioed Delia through intermittent static. "Gums pink," Celeste reported. "Breathing slowing, no shaking." "Keep her warm," Delia answered. "No more walking tonight." Ethan heard the instruction while cleaning the fuel line. No more walking, a limit spoken without shame. He and Saul restarted the generator shortly after dark. Heat moved through the hut slowly, reaching people in uneven waves. Later, after everyone had eaten and the storm pressed the windows into darkness, Ethan sat beside the stove, turning the small wrench on his belt between his fingers. Saul lowered himself onto the bench opposite him. "You know what you did wrong today?" Ethan looked up. "There are several options." "You still think the mistake was splitting the group?" "It was." "No, the mistake was believing you were only useful while deciding what everyone else should do." Ethan watched the stove flame through the iron vent. Years earlier, after a hurricane rescue overseas, his team had pulled survivors from a flooded coastal district. Ethan had coordinated boats, fuel, and extraction routes. He had stayed awake for 36 hours and left on the first transport after the final evacuation. The official report praised the operation. He had never returned for the recovery phase. Never sat with families identifying what remained. Never helped rebuild water systems or temporary shelters. Never learned what happened after the danger stopped being dramatic. "I completed the mission," he said. Saul waited. "And left." "Yes. I told myself the rest belonged to other people." "Did it?" Ethan looked toward the room. Loretta slept sitting upright, one hand still near the soup carrier. Jasper checked the door seal. Rena wrote the final head count. Celeste rested against the wall with Fable asleep beside her. "No," Ethan said. Saul leaned back. "Speed can pull someone off a slope." Ethan looked at him. "Patience is what keeps them alive after they come home." The words settled into the hut without asking to be answered. By morning, the storm had moved east. Sunlight struck the Bellwatch windows so brightly that the whole room woke at once. Outside, the San Juan ridges rose clean and white beneath a hard blue sky. The support team cleared the route after sunrise. No one hurried to leave. Ethan stood on the porch while the others packed slowly. Fable came beside him, tired but steady, her thermal coat catching the light. He had once believed strength meant reaching danger before everyone else. Fable had not brought him to Bellwatch to prove he could still do that. She had brought him there to show him something harder. A group was not safe because the first person reached shelter. It was safe when the last person did. The independent geological report arrived beneath a sky so clear it seemed almost impolite. 3 days earlier, the storm had buried roads, strained roofs, and forced 11 adults to climb toward Bellwatch at the pace of the slowest among them. Now sunlight blazed across the San Juan ridges, turning every drift brilliant and every damaged branch sharply visible. Winter had a talent for making consequences beautiful from a distance. Ethan read the report at the cooperative workbench while Fable slept near the stove. The old German shepherd had spent the day after the evacuation at Delia March's clinic. There were no new injuries, only exhaustion, stiff joints, and Delia's repeated warning that courage was not a medical exemption. Fable now wore her brown leather collar instead of the support harness. Her old red rescue rig hung from a peg beside Ethan's coat, cleaned but unrepaired. Delia had been clear. Fable was retired, not partly retired, not available for light heroics. Retired. Saul stood across the bench, reading the duplicate copy through a pair of glasses he claimed were temporary, despite having owned them for 4 years. Whitewater Row requires substantial maintenance, he read. Drainage repair, structural reinforcement, boiler replacement, snow load monitoring. Ethan turned the page. But not red level classification. No emergency evacuation. No automatic lease termination. Saul removed his glasses. For a moment, neither man celebrated. They had learned to distrust victories that arrived before the bills. Rena called later that morning with the rest. The county had formally withdrawn the emergency displacement proposal. Nolan Price's report had been removed from the active planning record. The state professional board had opened an investigation and temporarily suspended his consulting license while reviewing the altered captions, omitted objections, and authorization procedures. Silver Meridian still retained its conditional development agreement. The project had not vanished. It had acquired conditions. Any revised proposal would require an independent geological assessment, a funded transitional housing plan before demolition, worker representation on the planning committee, public disclosure of image sources, and relocation assistance tied to actual regional rents rather than a figure invented in a distant office. They can still build, Ethan said. Rena's voice came through the phone, dry and steady. Yes? So this is not over. Very little worth fixing ends cleanly. Across the workshop, Fable opened one amber eye. Rena continued. Avery Sloan has requested formal negotiations with the land board and worker representatives. Meaning she found a new route. Meaning the old one is closed. Ethan considered the distinction. It was not defeat for Silver Meridian. It was not triumph for Whitewater Row. It was a change table with more people allowed to sit at it. That afternoon, Loretta Vance learned the county had listed her as a proposed community ambassador. She marched into the cooperative, wearing her kitchen apron beneath an open parka and carrying the printed notice like evidence of a personal insult. My name is Loretta. Saul looked up from rebuilding a fuel pump. We were aware. I do not need a ceremonial title that sounds like I should cut ribbons beside a decorative shrub. Ethan read the notice. They probably meant it respectfully. That is how bad titles survive. Loretta accepted the role only after Miriam Solis had the wording changed to year-round worker representative. Jasper Molina took the second worker seat on the Land Oversight Committee. He did not call it bravery. He called it an inconvenient responsibility and asked whether meetings could avoid peak maintenance hours. Saul rewrote the cooperative's vehicle release policy. Every outside equipment request would now require 2 signatures, a named confirmation contact, a photographed equipment inventory, and a written distinction between public safety work and commercial surveying. He posted the new procedure above the dispatch desk. Under it, in smaller letters, he added, "Confidence is not documentation." Ethan left the sentence there. Bellwatch changed more slowly. The county did not hand the hut to the community. Buildings, unlike promises, came with insurance, liability, access agreements, and maintenance budgets. Instead, the land board approved a 3-year pilot lease to a new local trust. The man selected to manage it arrived carrying a brass keyring large enough to anchor a small boat. Gideon Mercer was 66, lean and slightly stooped, with silver hair brushing the collar of an old cobalt patrol jacket. A short white goatee sharpened his long face, and the upper joint of his right index finger was missing from a cable accident decades earlier. He stood beneath Bellwatch's bronze bell and looked around the hut with open suspicion. "I hear this is becoming a legal office," he said. "A legal access point," Miriam corrected. A soup kitchen, Gideon continued. Only during storms, Loretta said. A repair shop. On Saturdays, Saul added. An archive. Celeste held up a sealed box of photographs. Gideon looked at Ethan. And what exactly are you bringing? Ethan set down a replacement generator belt. Things that work. Gideon grunted. It was not approval, but it left room for future negotiations. He had supervised Bellwatch when it still served as a ski patrol relay station. He knew which wall trapped moisture, which roof seam failed in crosswind, and how often the bell's leather strap needed oil. At first, he objected to turning a rescue hut into what he called a mountain courthouse with soup. Then an older lift mechanic arrived, carrying an eviction notice he could not understand. Miriam sat with him at the long table for 40 minutes, translating contract language into choices. The next week, a laundry worker came with a broken space heater. Saul repaired the thermostat while Loretta packed her 2 containers of stew. Gideon watched both visits. Afterward, he replaced the sign on the door. The old one had read, Emergency Shelter, Authorized Personnel, Only. The new one read, Bellwatch Winter Access Station, come in before the problem becomes an emergency. He claimed the wording was temporary. No one believed him. Celeste transformed the former weather room into a community image archive. She mounted no heroic portraits. Instead, she taught workers how to record the facts that kept photographs honest: date, location, direction, weather, camera position, ownership, and why the image had been made. On the first workshop day, she placed 2 photographs of the same service road on the table. One showed a narrow white corridor beneath a threatening slope. The other, taken 20 steps to the left, showed barriers, drainage channels, and maintenance equipment. Neither photograph contains the whole truth, she told the group. Context is not decoration. It is responsibility. Mara's burgundy scarf remained around her neck. Fable lay beneath the table, on a thick blanket, the old navy cloth near her paws. Her future required its own paperwork. The records from Cascade Working Dog Trust were finally reconstructed through old veterinary bills, transfer forms, and archived emails. Fable had been moved to a retirement facility after the trust closed. During the facility's sale, several dogs were transferred under incomplete documentation. Fable had escaped from a poorly secured transport stop and disappeared before anyone completed the new placement. A regional retired working dog foundation accepted temporary guardianship. Delia assessed Ethan's home, the workshop, Fable's sleeping space, the stairs, the yard, and the distance to the clinic. You inspected less thoroughly when I bought the cooperative, Ethan told her. The cooperative does not have arthritis. The foundation approved a 90-day foster period. Celeste had the right to apply as well. That truth sat quietly between her and Ethan for several weeks. One bright morning, Celeste arrived at Bellwatch carrying Mara's navy cloth. Fable rose from her blanket and crossed the room to greet her, pressing her head briefly against Celeste's hip. Celeste crouched beside her. My apartment has 2 flights of stairs, she said later, watching Fable return to the stove. And no yard. We could make arrangements, Ethan replied. We could? She looked toward the old dog. Fable had settled beside Ethan's workbench, close enough to hear his tools, but far enough to avoid sparks. She remembers me, Celeste said. That is not the same as needing to live with me. Ethan did not answer quickly. Celeste smiled faintly. You are improving. At what? Not deciding before everyone else finishes? At the end of the foster period, the foundation transferred long-term guardianship to Ethan with Delia's recommendation and Celeste's written consent. The official certificate arrived in a stiff white envelope. Ethan placed it in the workshop safe. Saul found him there. You could frame it. No. Hang it near the office. No. Read it aloud at dinner. Ethan closed the safe. Go repair something. Saul smiled. There he is. Ethan refused a formal seat on Bellwatch's operating board. He said he had no interest in meetings, titles, or committees. Then he began spending 3 days a week at the station. He repaired generators, snowmobiles, stove vents, door hinges, and radio batteries. He drank coffee slowly enough for people to finish explaining why they had come. When someone brought in a broken heater, he started asking whether another heater remained at home. Sometimes the answer was no. Then the repair moved to the front of the line. The first official winter access day opened beneath light snowfall and a bright blue sky. Loretta carried soup through the door before Gideon finished checking the stove. Saul argued with a heater that clicked perfectly whenever anyone else approached it. Miriam arranged appointment cards beside the satellite terminal. Rena arrived with a newly released set of planning documents under one arm. Jasper pinned the next oversight meeting schedule to the wall. Celeste stood near the archive table, showing 3 lift operators how to label the reverse side of printed photographs. Write what stands outside the frame, she told them, especially when it changes the meaning. Fable slept near the fire. Her old red rescue harness hung on the wall above her blanket. The missing name patch had not been replaced. Celeste believed the empty rectangle should remain, not as proof that Fable had once been lost, as proof that an object could stop defining the life that wore it. Ethan stepped onto the porch. Snow drifted lightly across the trail. Footprints climbed from the lower forest toward the hut, wide work boots, narrow hiking boots, the tracks of a supply sled, and Fable's slower paw marks near his own. Once, Ethan had measured strength by distance and speed, how fast he could reach danger, how much weight he could carry, how quickly he could leave once the immediate problem was solved. Now he understood another measure. A door held open, a chair left available, a repair completed before someone had to ask twice, a person allowed to tell the whole story, including the part that hurt. Fable woke and came outside. She moved carefully in the cold, her right hip lower than the left, silver muzzle lifted toward the clean mountain air. She stopped beside Ethan and touched her nose to the back of his hand. The same gesture she had given him after 22 days beneath the workshop awning. Then it had been an invitation to follow. Now it asked nothing. Ethan rested his hand lightly against the side of her neck. Behind them, Gideon took hold of the bell rope. The bell was no longer rung to command patrol teams or mark an emergency across the valley. The new agreement allowed it at the beginning of severe weather and whenever a group reached shelter safely. Gideon pulled. The sound moved over the white ridges, deep and imperfect. Not a warning, not a declaration of victory. A promise made loudly enough to be remembered. No worker would disappear inside a line item without someone asking a name. No photograph would be allowed to speak without its missing context being sought. No person would be asked to cross the last stretch alone, simply because others could move faster. Ethan looked through the open door. No one inside was waiting to be rescued. They were repairing, arguing, documenting, eating, and making room. Fable leaned against his leg. The bell sounded again above them. And for once, Ethan did not feel the need to arrive first or leave early. He stayed until the final person came through the door. Sometimes the right thing is not reaching the finish line first. It is slowing down, looking back, and making sure no one has been left behind. In daily life, courage may look like asking one more question, listening to the whole story, or keeping a door open for someone who has nowhere else to go. Perhaps grace often arrives that way, not as thunder, but as the quiet strength to stay. Tell us what Fable and Ethan's journey meant to you. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories of loyalty, truth, and hope. May you be given the wisdom to notice who is walking last and the patience to walk beside them.